You did everything you were supposed to do. You hit the target, closed the deal, reached the stability you've been chasing, and then suddenly, nothing fits. You look at your life and it feels like the set of a play you no longer want to perform. The problem isn't that things are going badly. The problem is that even with everything in order, you're no longer in it. You feel like a stranger living inside an identity that has become too small, yet you don't have another one to step into. It's shipwreck on dry land. The person everyone recognizes has slipped away, but what's left behind is an empty outline. You're standing in the in-between, a dim corridor between who you were and who you still can't see. This isn't a phase or a simple dip in mood. It's a process with its own logic, triggered when the structure that held you breaks to make room for something that doesn't have a name yet. You're not broken, you're suspended. It can feel like you've outgrown your skin, with no new shape to grow into. The old scripts don't work, and the silence is loud for the first time. What happens when you stop being who you were, but you don't yet know who you are? The answer changes everything. Imagine you have what you wanted: a job, a partner, a home. One ordinary morning you wake up and realize the life you built no longer fits, like clothes that used to be yours but aren't your size anymore. You hit every milestone, yet the set feels cardboard thin, a cold stage where you feel nothing. When was the last time you achieved something important and felt absolutely nothing? This has a name, and Carl Jung was the first psychologist to grasp that human development doesn't end when you leave university. He was the first major theorist of the whole life arc, and he argued that psychological growth continues across our entire existence. Freud said you were the result of what happened before you were 5. The mold was already set. Jung listened, worked with him, and at some point said, no. A 45-year-old in crisis wasn't simply repeating childhood. He was being called forward. That's the difference between living with your head turned back, hunting for culprits, and living with your eyes ahead, searching for who you can become. Jung used the sun as a metaphor. Morning is the dawn of consciousness. It's when you build an ego, who you think you are, and a persona, the version the world sees, the professional, the dependable parent. Creating both is the work of the first half of life. The problem isn't building them. It's staying there and calling that the whole story. Your body knows before your mind does. After 35, something shifts. A knee that aches, energy that isn't the same. Jung noticed those changes aren't only biological. They're the most concrete signal that your life is also asking for a change of direction. The body warns you. Are you listening to what yours is trying to say today? You reach midday feeling on top. Then the sun begins its descent towards evening. What helped you climb won't help you come down. It's the afternoon of life, when the light changes angle and questions you never asked start asking you. You think, I've done this, I know how it goes, now what? Jung called it a return to the mothers. Something in you wants to go back down into depth and reassess everything. For years, to succeed, you ignored parts of yourself. This is your unlived life, a room in your own house you never dared open, where everything you might have been got trapped. Is there something you left behind just to function? Jung named the force behind it the drive to individuation. He said it isn't biological like hunger, it's an impulse towards wholeness. It operates whether you know it or not, whether you invite it or not, even whether you actively ignore it. It doesn't ask permission. It shows up as that emptiness, as the sense that the life you built isn't your size anymore. Do you recognize the moment when all the effort stops making sense? Jung didn't say this as a threat. He said it as a clinical observation. Some people reach 80 with an impeccable life, admired, socially respected. Yet inside, they never answered who they really were. They didn't collapse. They simply lived on the surface. That's a life too, but it's half a life. And somewhere deep down, they know it. Knowing you're at this point is one thing. Knowing exactly where you stand is another. Jung described 5 stages in the development of consciousness. Most people have no idea which one they're in. Next, you'll find out. And then you'll tell me where you are. Because what you recognize will not leave you untouched. It isn't a personality quiz or a self-help label. It's a map of what the psyche demands at different seasons. Once you see your stage, you'll understand why the old strategies stopped working, why the body is protesting, and why that corridor between who you were and who you are becoming feels so dark for you right now. Jung used to say that if you walk down any ordinary street, you don't meet only people of today, you meet the whole history of humanity. Inside an office suite, there can live a Neanderthal mind, and inside a luxury car, a medieval consciousness. The year you were born says nothing about the level of consciousness you are operating from. For Jung, being born is not waking up. We are born asleep, and awakening follows a map of 5 stages that very few people complete. It's a clinical claim. You may live in the 21st century, yet your mind can still be stuck in a stage humanity should have outgrown millennia ago. The first stage is what he called mystical participation, a total fusion with the world, like a baby who can't tell where its skin ends and its mother begins. As adults, we live this when we identify so completely with something external that we lose our own center. It's the fanatic who falls ill if the team loses, or the executive who collapses if the company fails. This isn't metaphor. It's the mechanism Jung describes. What are you so fused with today that if it breaks, you feel as if you stop existing? But that total fusion can't last. Eventually, life shakes you, and you discover you are not the same thing as what surrounds you. And then what you don't understand in yourself gets stuck onto others. First onto parents, seen as all-powerful gods, then onto a partner. When you fall in love, you don't see the person. You see a screen onto which you project what lives in you without your knowing. That's why it's so intense, and why it fades. When the projection collapses, the screen goes dark and you see an ordinary human, where you once saw someone extraordinary. Finally, you project onto your children the image of the divine child. Who did you place on a pedestal, only to watch them fall? For many people, development stops here. The earlier stages don't vanish when you move on. They keep operating underneath. You can be 40, have a doctorate, and still fall in love by projecting onto the other person the solution to everything you feel is missing. Progress doesn't mean erasing a stage. It means you are no longer ruled exclusively by it. In the third stage, projections shift into ideas, nation, God, ideology. Morality comes from duty, not from feeling. It's the person who recycles out of principle, not from pain for the earth. Here, charismatic leaders find their power by invoking faith or progress to move crowds who never ask whether they truly feel what they defend, or whether they're simply following an installed projection. Is there a cause, belief, or ideology you still serve out of loyalty, even though deep down you no longer feel it? Then we reach the empty center, the most dangerous and decisive stage. Here the projections seem to have died out, but Jung warns that this is an illusion. What has happened is that the ego has absorbed them all. The individual becomes the only judge of right and wrong. This is the territory of Nietzsche's Overman, or Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, killing an old woman just to discover what it feels like and whether his will has limits. With nothing above it, the ego becomes a tyrant. And the most disturbing part is that from the inside, that inflated ego feels perfectly reasonable. The modern individual believes he is the sanest person in the room. Modern fundamentalisms are desperate escapes from this void back into the previous stage. The fifth stage is reunification. Archetypal images are no longer projected. They are recognized as inner realities. Jung used dreams and active imagination to dialogue with these figures, not to destroy them, but to understand what part of you they represent. It's the difference between being ruled by something you can't see and relating consciously to what you finally recognize. And being between stages is exactly this. You've stopped being who you were, but you still don't know who you are. That isn't a mistake. It's the most honest moment. Watch your intense anger and your intense admiration. Where there is strong emotion, there is a projection. What you discover about those projections has a name in Jung. It's called the shadow. That sudden rage, or that admiration that leaves you speechless, has a specific source. It's made from the parts of you had to sacrifice to become who you are today. To build a self that functions, a steady professional, a respectable citizen, you had to leave a lot of potential outside the frame. It wasn't a mistake, it was survival. The problem is we assume what we excluded has vanished, when in fact it only moved into the basement of the mind. Jung called that basement the shadow. It isn't a dump of evil, it's a storeroom of unlived material. Your abandoned talents are there, and the feelings you refuse to feel because they didn't match your public image. Imagine being taught as a child that assertiveness was rude. That force didn't die, it became shadow. How do you see it now? In your exaggerated reactions? If you burn with fury when a colleague is selfish, you may be meeting your own repressed need to set boundaries. What irritates you most in other people? That's your shadow waving at you. It isn't only what you call dark. Often, it's what was inconvenient. Tenderness, ambition, sexuality, even joy. Whatever didn't fit the role you needed to survive was pushed down there, waiting to be seen, waiting to be lived. But the basement has more rooms. In every man, there is an unconscious feminine dimension, the anima, which represents his capacity to feel and connect. And in every woman, there is the animus, an inner force of decision and clear action. Because we rarely recognize these capacities in ourselves, we project them onto partners or authority figures. A man looks for in a woman the tenderness he forbids in himself, and a woman looks for in a man the authority she doesn't dare to claim. Who do you admire in a near irrational way? There too, you are projecting a part of your psyche that wants attention. The unconscious is not a passive spectator. It's a system that seeks balance. If you become too one-sided, living only for external success or the social mask, your psyche will try to compensate. Jung called this compensation. It shows up as recurring dreams, stupid slips of the tongue, or even physical symptoms medicine can't quite explain. It isn't punishment, it's a necessary course correction. When was the last time your body warned you something was wrong before your mind would admit it? If you ignore these signals, neurosis appears, not as a dramatic illness, but as a vital blockage. Life starts to feel narrow and repetitive because your energy is split. One part pushing forwards, another pulling back. You end up suspended, no longer who you were, not yet sure who you are. Shadow, anima, animus, compensation. These aren't separate problems. They're one system asking for the same thing, that you see it. That act of recognition is what Jung called individuation. Individuation is the work of bringing those split-off parts back into relationship, so you're not driven from the basement, but living from the house. But knowing the word is one thing. Understanding exactly how the process works, what drives it, what blocks it, and by what mechanism it moves is another. The discomfort you feel, the emptiness, the reactions you can't quite control, aren't malfunctions. They're evidence that an order larger than your will is trying to emerge. Jung didn't invent individuation as a well-being technique. He described it as a psychological process already operating in you. It's the inner force that pushes you towards the realization of your own nature. To become an individual is to become undivided, a unity no longer split between what you show the world and what you hide. Unlike Mahler's idea, which describes the child learning to say no in order to separate from the mother, a necessary but early step, Jung saw individuation as the work of a lifetime. It means integrating consciousness with the unconscious material that usually runs you, so your personality becomes a solid, differentiated, and whole structure. The engine is compensation. The unconscious behaves like a constant self-regulating system. If your conscious ego becomes too rigid, too logical, too one-sided, the unconscious produces a counterweight. This isn't punishment, it's balance. Jung noticed that isolated incidents, a recurring dream, an inconvenient lapse, an irrational irritation, are often pieces of a larger pattern. By studying series of dreams, he saw that these personal compensations arrange themselves towards a goal. It is the self leaving traces so you can find the way. What the ego calls mistakes are often the psyche's technical adjustments. Do you recognize a pattern that repeats, even when you can't explain why? It often begins quietly, a dream you can't shake, a sudden reaction that surprises you, a recurring frustration at work. These are not random glitches. They are clear signals that something in you wants space, truth, and integration now. This process is not gentle. It can feel like being caught between an anvil and a hammer. That sustained pressure, between who you believe you are and what your nature demands you become, is the condition for birth. The clash between conscious and unconscious isn't a nuisance to eliminate. It is the mechanism of transformation itself. Only through that friction do you gain tempering, the strength that forms when you stop running from what frightens you and stay with the tension of a real encounter. Is there an inner conflict you've been avoiding for years? Do you know what it is? The aim is wholeness, not perfection. That means allowing the archetype of the self to emerge, displacing the ego from its imagined center. The ego is not the architect of this process. It is a collaborator. It can join consciously, or it can resist, but the process does not wait for its permission. The ego can participate by becoming aware, or it can live at war with its own roots. Failure is possible. You can live a whole life without individuating. It isn't always a dramatic tragedy. It's a silent reduction. It's a successful life that is psychologically narrow. It happens when the ego suppresses the unconscious instead of entering dialogue with it. Energy stagnates, days become copies, and the sense persists that there is a dimension of you never truly inhabited. What part of you do you know exists, but you have never lived? If this system is already active, the real question isn't whether the process will happen. The real question is what this force looks like in motion when you stop resisting it. In 1928, a 55-year-old woman walked into Jung's consulting room. She wasn't ill in the narrow clinical sense. She was educated, academically trained, with a solid career, yet she felt profoundly stuck. She had built her identity on a rigid intellectual structure, identified almost entirely with logical thinking, her animus, while her emotional feminine side remained unconscious, operating in the background without her knowing. Jung didn't begin by dissecting her childhood or interpreting every sentence. He offered a different route, geschehen lassen, simply letting it happen. He asked her to start painting and to allow the unconscious to lead, with no ego direction, no aesthetic judgment, and no interference from the analyzing mind. She wasn't asked to paint well. She was asked to paint honestly, to let color and form arrive before interpretation, and to stay with whatever emerged, even if it seemed childish, ugly, or absurd. The point was not expression for its own sake, but contact, giving the unconscious a channel that bypassed her trained argumentative intellect. Day by day, the images began to organize themselves, and Jung could read in sequence how the psyche was moving towards balance, separation, and eventually a clearer inner center. What came through her hands over the following years became a visual record of the process Jung had tried to describe in words. In the first painting, a woman's body was set into a rock, straining to free herself but failing. Psychological stagnation turned into a physical image. In the second, a bolt of lightning struck the stone and knocked loose a rounded form. The patient linked that lightning to Jung himself. For her, he carried a massive projection of her inferior function, intuition, acting as the needed trigger for the core of her personality to separate from the undifferentiated unconscious. Jung didn't reduce the transference to sex or exploit it. He used it as the instrument individuation required in order to move. By the third painting, a dark blue sphere floated freely in space. She called it her true personality. Jung saw in it the birth of the self, and that image is what pushed him to study alchemy for the rest of his life, recognizing it as the oldest symbolic language of this integrating process. As the paintings continued, opposites began to find real balance. Yet in the 10th, the image of cancer appeared for the first time. She would die of that disease 16 years later. The psyche can register biological truths before the body shows them. At the end of her process, 10 years after analysis had finished, she was still painting her wholeness. Painting 24 showed a white lotus with a yellow center beneath a golden star, guarded by 2 serpents. It wasn't decoration. It was a symbolic map of a psyche that had learned to hold its opposites without destroying itself. She had disidentified from the animus and reunited with her feminine core, allowing the ego to step down and be relativized before the self. This case shows that individuation follows a structure that doesn't belong to the ego. If the self carries its own intelligence beyond our will, an inevitable question follows. How far might that logic go in your own story? Picture an aging scientist trying to compress decades of observation into a single diagram. Near the end of his life, in his late work Ion, Carl Jung sketched a geometric scheme that resembles the structure of a carbon atom. It wasn't decoration, it was a technical formula describing the movement of the self through 4 layers of reality, reshaping us from the root. Before we enter those layers, one shift matters. The self is not a fixed state, it is perpetual renewal. Jung compared it to the carbon-nitrogen cycle inside the sun, a core that processes incoming particles and emerges renewed without losing its essential identity. The self turns our daily experiences, breaks them down, recombines them, and aims them towards greater individual consciousness. Do you feel you're in a renewal you can't control, yet somehow know you need? It begins on the archetypal level, the realm of pure potential. The self speaks in images that change with age. The divine child in childhood, the hero in youth, the king or queen in maturity, and the wise old man in old age. These are the self adapting to each life season, guiding you towards the wholeness that fits that season. Which image grips you most, and what stage does it reveal? From there, the force descends into the shadow level. Here, the image becomes behavior and collides with the real world and its limits. Individuation has social consequences. When you truly change, your environment notices. Often your growth unsettles others because it disrupts the group's old balance and silently demands that everyone look at themselves. Have you felt your inner change make the people around you uncomfortable? The self's logic drops further into body and instinct. Jung suggested that deep psychological renewal can reorganize even biological structure. It is one of his most unsettling proposals, that physical matter may follow the form the psyche sets, and that inner change can leave real biological traces. Finally, the process reaches the level of pure energy, the subatomic. Here, we touch the origin of energetic crystallization. Jung linked this to the numinous charge of archetypes. the force that can feel as if it comes from outside you. It isn't just a new viewpoint. It's the sense that something in you is being rearranged at the roots without asking permission. As he explored this boundary, Jung was explicitly cautious, aware he was crossing into metaphysics. As a clinical suspicion drawn from observation, he proposed that the self might transcend the individual, a structure using human life as an instrument to embody itself in time and space, and whose rotation continues long after the ego dissolves. In that sketch, the 4 levels form quaternity, a mandala of movement rather than a ladder. The archetypal image is not up in the clouds. It presses downward until it meets your choices, your relationships, your work, your habits. The shadow stage asks for accountability in the everyday. The bodily stage shows that psyche is never only in the head. It is lived as appetite, fatigue, illness, and sensation. And the energetic stage hints that what we call change may coincide with shifts in the fabric of matter. The diagram is a reminder. Transformation is not truly partial in practice. Jung's diagram is not a romantic map of the soul. It is a formula for continuous renewal. It claims transformation happens on every level at once. And if that logic reaches down to pure energy, how far might that eternal motion reach beyond a single human life? Officially, Jung stopped at the 5th stage of consciousness. Yet in seminars and private conversations, he left traces of something he glimpsed beyond it. The man who spent his life mapping the human psyche reached a point where the map simply ended, and he kept looking ahead. He did not present it as certainty or revelation, but as an intellectually honest possibility a serious seeker must consider once reason meets its own edge. That boundary is the 5th stage, reunification, where the psyche itself becomes an object of conscious observation. It is the highest point Jung described with clinical confidence. Beyond it lies speculative territory, which he approached with explicit, necessary caution. Jung hinted at a possible 6th stage, an expanded ecological relationship between psyche and the outer world. He suggested that inner structures of mind might correspond to structures of being in material reality. For a culture trained in materialism, this development would mean recognizing a unity between the psychological, the symbolic, and the physical. It is not mysticism. It is the logical consequence of what synchronicity places in front of us. Have you ever lived a coincidence so precise you could not dismiss it as mere chance? He even touched on a possible 7th stage while studying Eastern yoga. He acknowledged that the East had reached states of consciousness far beyond what the West typically knows. At the same time, he held attention. He wondered whether Westerners can reach those levels within any foreseeable future. He did not close the gap, but he recorded the human potential he sensed there. That question drew him into dialogue with the quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli. Their conversations tried to decode links and correspondences between psyche and the subatomic world. For a thinker who had reached the limits of psychology, turning to physics was the next logical step. Synchronicity became the bridge, evidence that the border between inner and outer is more porous than we usually assume. He treated those hints as hypotheses, not slogans. He refused to turn them into a belief system because he knew how easily the ego grabs metaphysics to avoid psychological work. So he stayed grounded in symbols, dreams, and experience. What repeats, what insists, what transforms you. For him, the only honest proof was what changed a life from inside over time, in practice. Individuation has no final finish line. The self keeps moving beyond the ego, perhaps beyond a single individual life. What happens when you stop being who you were, but you still don't know who you are? Jung spent a lifetime answering that question. His answer was not a destination or a new identity. It was a process, the one work that lasts a whole life, and by everything he observed, may last longer still. that concludes our video. If you enjoyed the content as much as we did, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for future videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications to stay up to date with all our updates. Thanks for being part of our community. See you in the next video.